Hello everyone, welcome back from spring break. We're going to be moving into chapter 7 this week, and this is sort of going to be going over the founding of the nation, so it says. And what that means is they've sort of torn down this past idea of what the American nation, what these colonies are, and they're going to start again, imagining that there's somewhat of a blank slate, but still building on what they already had, what they've already learned about each other, and what they already thought, but trying to make this a more cohesive union between the colonies. John Adams noted that at this point, there were a lot of people, while many colonists were feeling connected to one another following the Revolutionary War, there were a lot of people who were feeling as if they were outside of the norm. So loyalists were either leaving or staying out of the limelight, basically, or people were having all sorts of different ideas about how to set up this new nation. And he's quoted as saying, "We have no Americans in America." And he's talking about how it seems that the nation is a bunch of divided groups. So the different colonies sort of still have their loyalty to each other, and they have their own laws that they're interested in following, especially when it comes to enslavement. We know that Vermont started their own state constitution that outlawed slavery. They were the first to do so, and people had differing ideas about how this should move forward. One of the questions that you're going to answer on the discussion board is, are we still like this? Is there some sense of Americanness? What does it mean to be American? What is that a thing that somebody could be, other than just strict nationality? Obviously, if you have a United States passport, that's what a lot of people would say. I mean this in more of the philosophical way that they're talking about. And we'll get back to that by the end of this presentation here, and that's what you'll talk about on the discussion board. Following the War for Independence, there was this need to construct a government specific to this new nation. It's not the one that we're most familiar with. First, for about a decade, there were what are called the Articles of Confederation. Often when this comes up, it will be referred to as a firm league of friendship. You can see this cartoon on the left here is pointing out all of the issues with the Articles of Confederation and sort of showing the sinking ship about to be taken down by the waters. Some of those issues stem from the idea that there was an attempted balance between state and national rights. So if they were going to be this connected nation of different states rather than separate colonies, there was the need to tie them together at a national level while still providing autonomy within the new states, former colonies. What they decided was that there would be one vote per state and one house in the nation. There would be no president, and there would be no judiciary. So there would be no national court system, and there would be no top person in charge. There were no taxes or regulatory powers that were national. There were still local taxes, there were still state taxes, but there was no national pool for taxes. And to go along with that, there was no national armed force of any measure at this point because there were no taxes to support it. If there was an attempt to make an amendment to these Articles of Confederation, it required unanimity, meaning that everybody had to agree. Each state had to agree, and not surprisingly, this means that there were no amendments passed in this decade. It was written in 1777 and ratified, which means agreed upon, and put into action in 1781, but only lasted until 1788. And then we move into the phase where we get the Constitution that we still operate under at this point. Another question at this point was how to move further west and include new lands in this new nation. Western land, as we know, had been of interest for a long time. It keeps coming up over and over again. People had made rules about not going beyond the Appalachian Mountains, and again, people were still interested in expanding out west to gain land and to set up their own local societies that were outside of the ones that had been longer established at this point. The thing is, Native Americans were still living in these Western territories. So when now Americans began moving further and further west, they kept pushing people out or fighting against them and killing them. Native Americans were not considered citizens of the new United States, and that actually isn't going to come up at all this semester. It wasn't until 1924 that Native Americans were allowed to have U.S. citizenship. But it had been this way, so this was a continuation to not offer them citizenship, but it was especially hammered down upon because the Native Americans, many of them, had aided the British during the War for Revolution because they foresaw this attempt to take over the entire continent, basically, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The Ordinance of 1784 was put into place regarding self-government for the West. Eventually, many of these areas became states, and slavery was permitted in the Western Territory. And while this was profitable for many in the South, especially the Deep South, this was troubling to more people in states that were starting to see slavery go by the wayside, and larger emancipation movements and abolition movements forming within the northern states. The Ordinance of 1785 was about regulating land sales in order to control settlement and raise money and to section off land via the federal government. So what this means is they were hoping to control the areas that were becoming part of the United States within the Western Territory, and they were looking to have more federal control there. The problem is, when you don't have a strong federal force, you can't enact a lot of federal laws. If people aren't willing to follow the rules that you're setting out at a federal level and are instead looking at things from a state level, it's null and void. The Northwest Ordinance, going into action in 1787, was setting up 3 to 5 states in this Northwest area. Now, we think of the Northwest as Washington and Oregon at this point, but in 1787, this was the area you see on the map here is actually the Northwest. This is beyond the regular borders of the United States at this point. Initially, it was said that Native Americans would be treated fairly, and this was in an attempt to avoid further warfare between Native American groups and now American citizens. And mostly this is because war is expensive, and people were tired of fighting wars at this point. Technically, there was no slavery allowed within these 3 to 5 states. What did happen, however, was that people still managed to keep slaves and sneak them into the new areas that would then become states. So while it was prohibited, people weren't necessarily punished There was a limited oversight in these new areas, meaning that people could get away with a lot more at the beginning. Shays' Rebellion is one of these uprisings that you'll keep hearing about in history courses. I do have a documentary that you can watch, and this will be posted on the assignments page for you to see. And this took place in 1786 into early 1787, and this was a farmer uprising due to a massive amount of debt that individuals had. The people participating in this uprising referred to themselves as sort of like the regulators that we had talked about in the South that were trying to do away with corruption in the local governments. And they were attempting to avoid land seizures due to their debts in Western Massachusetts. So right about where you all go to school, the farmers were fearing that the land would be repossessed by the government because they owed money. Daniel Shays is the leader of this group. He was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And what ended up happening here is that this uprising against the rich and against those in power, the governor lended no sympathy to those participating in the uprising because he was afraid of the people. That there had long been this idea that this mob mentality, this group of people would overtake everything and pull the entire nation down. Especially at this point, it was a new nation. Those at the top feared that it would be spoiled quite quickly. Thomas Jefferson is even quoted as saying, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with blood of patriots and tyrants." Now, this sounds like an interesting quote, like it could be from Game of Thrones or something in that realm. It's less interesting and less fun if you are the patriot or you are the tyrant. So if they're suggesting that people are expendable in the name of liberty, that's the idea that people are going with, or suggesting that there are things worth fighting for and worth dying for. This sort of serves as a point where people, rather than the central government, are seen as the problem. So seeing the larger groups of regular people rising up rather than a tyrannical government running from up top. This is where the rhetoric starts to turn towards government as a force for good and against mob rule, essentially. So please watch the short documentary on Shays' Rebellion. Convention is where the Constitution really started to take form. In 1787, in Philadelphia, people gathered in order to create a new constitution. And this is because the Articles of Confederation that they've been functioning under up until this point absolutely weren't working. They didn't have enough control over what was happening. There was no strong federal net to bind the different states together. So what they were looking to do was sort of create this balance between national and state identity. 55 wealthy, educated men gathered here, and it was only about 0.1% of the population at the time had attended college, but more than half of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention had. So this was an even smaller portion of the 1% who was gathered here. Veterans were 22 out of 55 of the delegates as well. This is a much higher number than we currently have and that we've had for a very long time within the government. They were essentially meeting, as we said, to decide a new framework because the Articles of Confederation were not working. And they came up with a few different ideas. The first being the Virginia Plan, which was a two-house legislature with state population determining how many delegates would be sent to the federal House. Another plan was called the New Jersey Plan. This is a single house with one vote per state. And this was more similar to the Articles of Confederation. So people were less interested in repeating what had just failed and interested in pursuing something else. So the Virginia Plan is more interesting than the New Jersey Plan to most who were gathered there. In September 1787, 39 men signed the Constitution and sent it to the states for ratification. Prior to this, and during this process of ratification, Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay had been writing furiously to convince people about whether or not the country should move forward in the way that it was being proposed. For the most part, the argument was that the Constitution was argued as a protective measure rather than a restrictive measure. So it was in order to combine and protect the different states and to ensure that there wouldn't be any monarchy resurfacing. What they required was the consent of the people, but at the same time, they believed that the people were incapable of ruling themselves. And more diversity would mean that there was less chance someone or something would take over. This does not mean diversity in the same way that we think about it now. They were not interested in extending the vote to non-white people, nor were they interested in expanding the vote to women who were either non-white or white. The anti-federalist argument is that there was not enough liberty and that small government needed to be the ideal to aspire to. You can see in this graphic here the federalist versus the anti-federalist argument. I think these kinds of illustrations are helpful for a lot of people to visualize what we're talking about. So the Federalists were interested in a national government. It was often supported by the wealthier class, and some of those people involved are Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, James Madison, and John Jay. And you'll recognize that those were the publishers of the Federalist Papers that we were talking about before on the previous slide. And with the strong central government, they had the idea that there would be checks and balances to protect from tyranny, and there would be support from urban areas, such as merchants and skilled laborers, meaning that there would be a city and then there would be the hinterlands that would have the symbiotic relationship where the hinterlands would provide the materials for the city to then produce items that would be either sold within the city or the money that those within the hinterlands earned from selling these items could then use to pay for these items as well. They were interested in having small states with weaker governments, and the idea would be that the national government would reign supreme over all of the states. Not necessarily that the states would be entirely powerless, but that they would have to bow down to the national rule. And the anti-federalist argument is that state government is more important than national government. It was often sponsored by the middle to lower class with the idea that they would more directly see the benefits to the decisions that were being made on the state or local level. The sponsors of this include Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Richard Henry Lee. And the anti-federalist argument was that they believed at the national level that was controlled by the wealthy class that there would be large abuses in power. And they also believed that this privileged minority would be considered greater than the rights of the majority. So they believed that what was happening that caused Shays' Rebellion, for example, would continue to happen, that regular people, farmers, low-skilled workers, even artisans, would be taken over and told what to do and just be at the mercy, basically, of this national government. They garnered a lot of support from rural areas for those reasons. And states with really strong economies supported it as well, because they didn't necessarily want to pool in with the rest of the states on a national level, because that would bring them down financially. So we see that these Articles of Confederation need to be replaced. You can see over here on the right-hand side, the white side of the slide here, talk about the Articles of Confederation and Shays' Rebellion, which we've already discussed. And what ends up happening is that there's sort of this synthesis of both. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights express both ideals. And we've seen this sort of change over time. There's been political division since the beginning. This is not a new thing, although people will note that it may be more prominent than it has been at other times. It's certainly not the first time that there have been heated debates about politics in the United States. So this deserves a cat, because this is a lot of information, and it's a lot of detailed information, and some of it can be a little bit overwhelming, so we have the cat. Very cute. Aside from the cat, we'll go on with what we ended up with as a governmental structure that we're currently living under. We have 3 branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. So you have the executive branch, meaning the president, and you have the legislative branch, which would be Congress, and you have the judicial branch, which would be the Supreme Court of the United States. There is a 2-house Congress, so this is the legislative branch. You have the House of Representatives, which is population-based, and each serve 2 years. Population-based meaning you get a certain number of representatives based on the population of your state. For example, if you had 10 people and that meant you got 1 representative, then if you have 20 people, you get 2. Just bringing the numbers down so that we don't have to look at the exact states, and it's just an easier way to explain the concept. The Senate, each state has 2. So California and Rhode Island have the same number of senators. They serve for 6 years, and there are different election cycles because there are different times in which states became states. The idea is that this is a middle ground, like we discussed, both Federalist and Anti-Federalist, and sort of this middle ground between democratic and authoritarian. So there's this control over what's happening at the higher levels, but there are people who are supposed to be able to choose who is participating at these higher levels. The Electoral College, I've found a short documentary for you to explain the Electoral College, but the basics of it are that we choose electors in our states, and we have a certain number of electoral votes that go along with a particular state, and whoever becomes president needs to earn a certain number of electoral votes. This is different than the popular vote. We've seen this be different twice within the last 2 decades, with the year 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush, and the 2016 election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, where you had the popular vote, meaning the number of votes cast in that person's name, being different than the number of electoral college votes received. The electoral college vote is what actually determines who becomes president. So please watch that documentary, and it will further explain the electoral college. There are some movements in current days to do away with the electoral college, because it was initially set up with the idea that the people would not be able to choose their leader for themselves, and they needed people who were assigned to choosing, basically, with the popular vote as sort of a suggestion for their decision making. Federalism is a word that you will hear over and over, and this is meaning the division of powers between national and state powers. So there's not just a national government that dictates all of the state rules as well. There are state rules, and then there are national rules. The idea between all of these branches of government, separate houses of Congress, the Electoral College, and the state and national rights, is that there would be some separation of powers, with the hopes that they would provide checks and balances to one another. Checks and balances and separations of power are sort of these terms that you keep hearing come up even now. But the idea was, if you separated things out, it would be less likely that some authoritarian would come in and take over. Congress was endowed with new powers at this point. Remember, they had very limited powers under the Articles of Confederation, or no powers, basically. But they were now allowed to levy taxes, borrow money from other countries, regulate commerce, declare war, and deal with foreign affairs. Foreign affairs at this point includes Native Americans, so relations between the Americans and the Native Americans. National law supersedes state law at this point. It does not mean that individual state laws are completely worthless, however. They sometimes do have separate laws that do not follow necessarily the national law. One example of that right now is the legalization of recreational marijuana. Some states have voted to allow this and operate places where you can purchase this with a pretty hefty tax usually, but it's income for the state. Now at the federal level, it's still a controlled substance, meaning that it's not necessarily legal, and this has caused problems for people who wanted to put their money away in a bank, because those are federal buildings, federal banks. So there are tricky situations when national law supersedes state law, or when state law is allowed to sort of skirt around national law. I'm bringing up one that's happening right now, but this has happened over and over again since this has been established. You may have also heard in recent years that you need a 2/3 majority to override a presidential veto. So if the president receives a bill, if it comes all the way through Congress, through the House of Representatives and through the Senate, and all the way up to the president, they are allowed to veto this still if they have proper cause to do so. But that's not the final say. It could still be moved back down, and a 2/3 majority in the Senate would be required to overcome this veto. So this is another idea where there would be this set of checks and balances, and that one person wouldn't be able to take over the entire nation. Within the judicial branch, judges serve for life. This has also come up in recent times. Seems a lot of these constitutional issues have been coming to light, and people are often learning about them now, which is great for everybody to be aware of their own constitutional rights. Judges who are voted into the Supreme Court of the United States serve for life. And the idea behind that is that they would make sound decisions rather than worrying about being reelected or losing their seat based on the decision that they're making. They should be making their decisions based on the legality of the situation and what the law says, what precedent says, etc. Some people are calling for this life term for judges to be finished and just have a set term that people are allowed to serve, and not allow people who may eventually be out of touch with the currents within society to enter into the judiciary. The president can also be impeached by the House and removed from the office by the Senate. This is something that they wrote into the Constitution in the hopes that if things did get out of control at some point, there was still this sort of exit strategy. And this came up during the Bill Clinton presidency. He was indeed impeached by the House of Representatives, but that does not mean that you are then removed from office. The Senate still has to decide to remove you from office, even if you are impeached by the House. So this can get pretty murky, but it is possible to remove somebody from the office of the presidency should they not be living up to the laws set out for the nation. The preamble of the Constitution is the part that most people are familiar with. Same thing with any of the state constitutions, and same thing with the Declaration of Independence that we've already been over. But we'll just read through this quickly for you. It says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So what they're looking for is to better this union between all of the states. They're looking to establish justice, meaning set up just and fair laws as they saw them. Ensure domestic tranquility, meaning not to have these warring factions between the different colonies. Provide for common defense, meaning that there would be a national armed force, which they did not have under the Articles of Confederation. And promote the general welfare, with the idea that there would be sort of shared resources between the states, not a redistribution of wealth, because it was not initially set up as a socialistic nation. And they were hoping that by establishing these rules, by establishing this nation as so, that they would make them so that they were moldable to posterity, meaning the future generations that they knew would come to live under these rules. I have another graphic here to explain the three branches of government. As we discussed, the legislative branch is Congress, which is made up of the Senate, 100, because there are 50 states at this point. This is today, obviously. There weren't initially 50 states in the United States. And the House of Representatives currently has 435 representatives. The executive branch, which carries out the laws or can vote them down, actually, is made up of the president, the vice president, and the cabinet. And the Supreme Court, as we've discussed, and as you probably know from recent news, is made up of 9 justices, and they are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and they hold a life appointment. So they were hoping that by setting up these 3 separate branches that they would allow each one of them to sort of curtail the power of the others. While this whole thing is being set up, while they're dreaming up all of these ideas, all of these laws that they're hoping to maintain for people, you still have this issue of enslavement. There were both abolitionists and slaveholders as part of the Constitutional Convention. So those who were writing the Constitution were on both sides of the slavery issue. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were slaveholders. They said that they did not like the institution, but they were still using it. So many people thought that this institution would die out on its own, but they weren't necessarily willing to drop those within under their own power. They sometimes, as we mentioned before, would allow for the next generation of enslaved people to escape from slavery and gain their freedom. But oftentimes people were conflicted about what they were doing, but they continued to do it. And part of what was put into the Constitution was that there would be an end to the African slave trade. So that triangle that we had talked about before, less of a triangle at this point because there was no close relationship to Britain, but there were still people being moved from the African nations on the western coast over to the Americas, both North and South America. And what happened was that there was an end date set to this African slave trade, but it allowed the slave trade to continue for 20 years after the Constitution was written. So on January 1st, 1808, which is 20 years after the Constitution goes into effect, they were prohibited from importing more slaves from Africa. Within that 20-year gap, 170,000 more enslaved people were brought from Africa to the Americas and to the United States. And we know that enslaved people were also creating families of their own. They were often all living together and had relationships with each other that weren't legally recognized marriages for the most part, but they were marriages all the same, and had families. And that increased the number of enslaved people. There's a video that you'll see on the assignment page that is a Hamilton rap. It's a rap battle from the show Hamilton, and it has animation rather than people acting it out. And I'll also post the lyrics for that if you want to look at that. But it's a pretty brilliant way of bringing this history to a common ear and to a current time. So if you could watch that and look at the lyrics, you'll see how this is related to the African slave trade. And it's just another way that we can dig further into history or make history more popularized for people to consume. what was still required at this point was the return of fugitive slaves. There was a fugitive slave clause that meant that if an enslaved person escaped from a slave state, they were to be returned to the person who technically owned them at that point. You also saw the 3/5 compromise, this infamous deal where 3/5 of the slave population would count for the House of Representatives population requirements and the Electoral College. So what happened is that the power of the vote was skewed to give the South more power than it should have had based on the population that was actually able to vote. Women were also included in the House of Representatives population requirement and the Electoral College count, even though they also couldn't vote. 3/4 of the first 16 presidents were Southern slave holders. This 3/5 compromise gave the smaller population that could actually vote and could actually run for office a leg up, essentially. The Bill of Rights were part of the reason that they weren't included in the initial Constitution and that they are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution was because of slavery. They thought if they had put them within this initial Constitution that they would have to apply these rights to enslaved people as well. It was state by state that the status for free Black people was up for debate. And there was a growing abolition movement, a growing emancipation movement, including schooling for free African Americans in the North. But this didn't mean that their legal rights expanded greatly. It meant that they were sort of inching along in progress. There were some states that free Black men had the right to vote as well, but very few still at this point. Open immigration between the different states was only open to white Europeans. So there was no open immigration for free people from Africa or many free people from Asia at this point. What they were interested in was importing more white Americans who were either familiar with English or spoke English as their first language. Part of the issue for some who were deciding upon the Constitution when it comes to the freedom of African Americans is that many of them thought that African Americans did not have the capability of reasoning, and so they didn't need freedom or rights. They had these pseudoscientific ideas that Black people would not be able to do the same things that they were doing, and so henceforth they didn't need the right to vote or to run for office. Jefferson, as well as many others, thought that if African Americans did manage to become free, that they should leave the United States because they believed that they would never be able to assimilate. There's a long history surrounding that idea, and we'll get into it over and over again this semester. And if you should take U.S. history too, you'll still be getting into it. But you'll read Thomas Jefferson's On Race and Slavery, and you'll hear his own words about what he thought about this subject. Native Americans, we talked about this a little bit before, but just a reminder that this new Constitution was not here to cover them. There were 3 options, essentially. People could move further west and off the lands that they were used to living on. They could probably die in battle, or they could assimilate into white culture, which was pretty stark. In 1791, Little Turtle of the Miami Confederacy killed 630 Americans in the Ohio Valley as Americans moved into their territory. This was the sorts of wars that the new Americans, and certainly most of the Native Americans, were hoping to avoid. They'd been finished with warfare at this point. They weren't looking to start new battles. A couple years later, after this win for Little Turtle, he was eventually defeated. And that meant people were killed, and the rest of the people who weren't killed were either pushed further towards the west or sometimes still taken into slavery. The European American sensibilities were still that the Native American gender norms remained an affront to their sensibilities, essentially. The European Americans were still interested in what we now consider this more traditional idea that women were to do particular jobs, support their husbands, raise children, and not necessarily serve in government. Certainly, they're not about to serve in government if they can't vote, and they weren't supposed to make their own legal decisions still. You read Abigail Adams' letter to her husband, and you get the idea of the limited rights for women at this point. Some people thought that Native Americans could successfully be integrated into the American society. So this is different than what many people thought about African Americans, and this had been a continuing state of hypocrisy for many people. And Jefferson was actually one that believed that Native Americans could integrate. So he believed that African Americans could not, and he believed that Native Americans could integrate into the white American society. But this didn't stop people from breaking treaties over and over and over again. You have people just constantly, essentially, being promised that they could keep a particular tract of land, or that they would work together on a particular area, and that they would still have hunting rights and these sorts of things. But over and over and over again, people were killed, people were still pushed out. These areas were still taken over by European American rule. Now, the Bill of Rights here did not apply to all people at the time. It was not included in the original Constitution because they weren't really sure who the people were. And this led to a lot of struggle for people, because it was essentially what happened, same thing that happened following the Revolutionary War, that this language had been used to express the kinds of freedom that people were fighting for. And at the same time, now, they were setting up particular rules that people would then say should also apply to them. These first 10 amendments to the Constitution were seen as inherent to the human condition. So while they say that inherent to the human condition, they did not think it was inherent to women's condition, nor did they think it was inherent to non-white male conditions. The English common law is sort of the basis for, or the inspiration for this. A lot of the ideas are the same. And with this, religious freedom was finally the law of the land. So while it's the law of the land, that doesn't mean there's not individual discrimination on a local level or even sometimes on the state level. But we'll read through the Bill of Rights now. You have the essential idea of them here, with the first being freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. That, and probably the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, are likely the ones you're most familiar with. They're the ones that people often keep bringing up. Issues come up surrounding both of these quite often, and they have for quite some time. And the Third Amendment is one that we don't often think of anymore, and it has to do with the quartering of soldiers. So needing to put up room and board essentially for soldiers. This is included in there because, as you'll remember, Britain had made it a law prior to the Revolution that the British soldiers would have access to people's homes to stay. The Fourth Amendment has to do with arrests and searches, saying that you need a warrant, essentially. And the fifth deals with the rights of accused persons. So you'll hear people oftentimes say, I plead the fifth, meaning you need not incriminate yourself and that you have rights as an accused person. The Sixth Amendment has to do with the right to trial for crimes. We know that there was a lot of vigilante justice throughout time in the United States, and there continues to be some. But the idea is that you would have a trial if you were accused of a crime, and that the trial would be fair. And the Seventh Amendment has to do with civil cases rather than criminal cases. The Eighth Amendment is limitations on bail and punishment, so no cruel and unusual punishments, even as the death penalty continues to be used in many states. It's up for debate. Some of the language is really vague so that people would make their own decisions as a group. And number 9 addresses the rights that are kept by the people, and 10, the powers kept by the states. And we can read them here. So a lot of this gets technical and a little bit heavy, and so we need the bear here, asking where the bear arms are coming from. It's very concerned over there. Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, you should just be familiar with these. These are your very basic rights as an American citizen. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So you're allowed to protest, you're allowed to say what you think, and you're allowed to have your own religion. The Second Amendment states that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is obviously an amendment that people debate about a lot. They debate about the meaning of this, and they have for a long time, but it's definitely ramped up in recent years that people have been more concerned about what this means. I'm not here to tell you what to think about that, but that's what it says, and you can make up your own mind what makes sense to you. The Third Amendment, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. So this is the not needing to provide shelter to a soldier as a reaction to what happened following the Boston Tea Party. The Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So no unreasonable searches and seizures, essentially. And people need a warrant to come in and look at your place if you say no. The Fifth Amendment, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land of or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject to the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So this one actually has a lot in it. You can't have double jeopardy. A lot of people learned about that from that movie that came out. But you basically can't be tried for the same exact crime twice. So if people just don't believe you and think that something happened, they can't keep trying you for the same thing. And you can't be called to be a witness against yourself, or you can't be forced to. And you are gifted with due process of the law. And the private property being taken for public use without just compensation is this idea of eminent domain, that the government may at some point need the property that you are living on, but they need to compensate you for that appropriately. The Sixth Amendment, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. So you're given a lawyer, essentially. You have the right to a lawyer, and that's where you often hear public defenders coming in. So if someone doesn't have the money to hire a lawyer, they still are allowed to have one. And they're allowed to have a speedy and public trial with a jury. The Seventh Amendment, in suits at common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall otherwise be re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. So this is for civil law, civil cases that usually have to deal with money. So if a landlord is unpaid and they're suing somebody for the money, this is being addressed here. The Eighth Amendment, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. This one is often up for debate as well, whether or not the death penalty is a cruel and unusual punishment. So again, not here to tell you what to think, but that is what it says. The Ninth Amendment, the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So if they have additional rights, the Constitution is not here to squash those. The 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So anything that's not within the Constitution, the people can choose to make up their own rules, or the state will make up their own rules that then the people could follow. So the question is, who gets to be an American? The people as it's stated in the preamble to the Constitution, they were identified within this as well as Indians and other persons. So the people, meaning the white males who are allowed to participate in the governmental structure either by voting or by running, and Indians or Native Americans who were not included within this, and other persons, meaning enslaved people, so African people, both men and women. The idea of the people has changed drastically over time, as you know, as more people had rights expanded to them. They were allowed to vote, they were allowed to own property, they were allowed to make their own legal decisions, they were allowed to become citizens at all, and they were not being held in the bonds of slavery now and for quite some time. There are a few other concepts that we should go over with this idea about who gets to be an American, what is it that an American is, other than a national status. So civic nationalism is open to all involved with political institutions and social values. So there's this idea that you could be American and that you're involved with the political institutions, you're interested, you're participating, you're talking about things, you're following the same social values as the rest of the nation. And then there's ethnic nationalism, which is ethnic heritage, language, and culture. So sometimes when Eastern Europeans or people from outside of Europe at all were moving to this new country, they were not ethnically similar. They did not have the same language. They did not often have the same culture. And this was problematic for a lot of people, either coming in and facing loads of discrimination, or those settled here who were European Americans found it problematic for themselves to be faced with different groups of people moving in and it no longer feeling like a cohesive nation if they had thought that there was one. So everyone had their own ideas about what this meant. And national identity is something that often comes up, and it's this American identity, this American idealism, this American way of being. But it's unclear if the United States has this, or if it ever has had this. Has there been a united front at some point? National consciousness is a little bit different in that it focuses on the memory of what has been. So it's not necessarily just this abstract idea of what is this national identity? What does it mean? It's what has happened. What is our shared history, essentially? And in the past couple decades, this has expanded greatly into women's history, into African American history, into Asian American history, into Native American history. So we're having more pieces of this consciousness stitched together to create a more cohesive narrative for the nation. What I wanted to finish on so that you could go to the discussion page and write what this means, what you think this means, is I typed Americans into Google and did an image search, and I just took a little screenshot of what came up. It's going to be different for everybody based on what you've been Googling and what you say around your computer and all that sort of creepy stuff. But this is essentially what came up. This is vastly different than what may have come up, what would have come up should the internet have existed in the 1700s. There certainly wouldn't be this level of diversity. There wouldn't be a TV show. there obviously wasn't the internet, and there wouldn't be flags with 50 stars, all that sort of stuff. But all of this to say that rights have been expanded greatly. There has been a lot of progress. There are still many things that we're obviously working on within this framework of the nation that was set up at this point. But it's unclear if we're any closer to the idea of what American means, what America is. So that's your question that you'll go to the discussion board to figure out. So please write on that, and feel free to comment on people's writings, but please remember everything needs to be kept civil. In your Voices of Freedom book, what you'll be reading out of there are 42, 43, and 44. So Patrick Henry's anti-federalist argument. So this is an argument against the federal ideal that there would be this larger umbrella with a more controlling aspect to it. You have a 4th of July oration, and this is a really important piece, I think, and that it starts to talk about what this independence meant, what it meant to different people, and it's quite poignant. I think you'll find it interesting when you read it. And to finish, you'll read Thomas Jefferson on race and slavery. You may be surprised by some of the language that these names that you're familiar with use with regard to these sensitive topics, but it's best to know what people actually said and what they thought, and then have a realistic idea of how they operated as a person, and what they've meant to our society, both good and bad. So we'll move on to chapter 8 next week, and we'll start talking about securing the republic. So you have this setup, this sort of framework, and see how it's starting off and how people are dealing within that. So we'll catch back up in about a week. So please watch all of the videos that were posted for you and submit your responses to the Voices